Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to City Talk here in Toronto. It's midday. In the west, it's mid-morning. In the far west, it's early morning. And in the east, it's a little further into the afternoon tea time. We're very appreciative of you joining us once again for City Talk, candid conversations in the time of COVID. I'm Mary Rowe, the president and CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute. CUI is in the connective tissue business, and since COVID, we've been putting up platforms to try to facilitate learning from practitioners working across the country in different urban environments. CityWatchCanada.ca and CityShareCanada.ca are both there and being updated daily by volunteers and partners from across the country. And they give you a picture of what municipal governments are doing, how they're responding now as they're reopening, how are the measures that they're taking and the steps that they're taking changing. And similarly, CityShare Canada is where we're showing examples of really smart innovation coming from communities and institutions and individuals, every kind of self-organizing activity that has been surfacing post us going into lockdown. And you'll see remarkable things there. Whenever I feel a bit depressed about what's going on, I go and spend 15 minutes perusing CityShareCanada.ca, and then you'll get inspired again because you see just how resilient Canadians are and how smart and innovative people are being as they try to cope with this and imagine what their life together needs to look like and how it needs to evolve. If you want to help us with this is, as I suggested, powered by volunteers and partners from across the country, and you've got half an hour to be a City Watcher or a City Sharer every day. We'd really be happy to have you. So please email us at covidresponse@canurb.org, covidresponse@canurb.org, and join our happy band of gang who've been working on this and reinventing it every couple of days to make it useful for policymakers, decision makers, and people, as I suggest, like me, who just need to understand what's going on and feel inspired by all the smart things that people are doing on the ground. These broadcasts CUI originate in Toronto, although we make sure that we have coverage across the country because we're a national organization. And Toronto is on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis, who are drawn from across Turtle Island. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Anishinaabe nations. And we try to keep this in mind as we have these discussions, those are the lands that we are the stewards of and the inheritors of, and work in partnership, and we hope in reconciliation with our First Nations colleagues and neighbors. The other thing that we acknowledge here is that while we have these conversations and hundreds of people are coming on, and we appreciate the enthusiasm with which people have welcomed this platform as we try to make meaning and try to understand what the implications are COVID, we are aware that thousands of Canadians around the country are continuing to be engaged in first-line emergency response, saving lives and keeping people safe. And we don't want these conversations in any way to preempt that or in any way interfere with that operation. And we're very aware of that and supportive of our colleagues who are still engaged in that kind of work. In fact, I would say one of the themes that has emerged for us is how central municipalities and municipal governments and local organizations are when a crisis like this occurs. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today with these two esteemed gentlemen, is what does that look like in terms of federal policy, federal investment, and corporate investment, and how are we going to come out of this in a way that our communities can be more resilient and more responsive and more, because they have had so much demanded of them under these circumstances. So these two have sat around cabinet tables. They've had, after I'm sure raucous sessions in legislatures, they've gone out for drinks with people from across the aisle, trying to figure out what the future should be for cities across the country. And we're very appreciative to have them. Before I introduce them, I'm just going to suggest that if you're participating on this, please, we encourage you to use the chat box, and you can see that you can select on the chat, as I'm going to do right this minute, you can select that your messages go to all panelists and attendees, and we're encouraging you to do that. So sign up for the chat and just have a go over there, because we're finding that the chat function is a really rich conversation area. And lots of people post questions and comments, and then people within the chat respond. So it's really valuable. The other thing is that we post the video of this conversation, which we're recording. We also post a transcript. We post 5 takeaways, and we also post the chat. So keep in mind, whatever you put in the chat is going to live in the chat for a long time. So be smart and thoughtful over there, and be provocative, and we're really keen to have you. I monitor the chat. I suspect both of these gentlemen probably will too, but I will feed into them to make sure that we're circling back on the topics that you want to see covered. We also, of course, those of us that are savvy enough, and I have colleagues that are very savvy with this, thank goodness, because I'm not. If you'd like to continue to have a conversation on social media, this is just the beginning, obviously. There's not a topic that we're covering in City Talk that can be sealed up and done in an hour, not a single one. So the conversations begin here, and we hope they continue robustly, and we'd encourage you to post using the hashtag CityTalk. We also have an evaluation mechanism that we put on here for us to improve City Talks. So if you'd like to give us some feedback on that, great. The other thing is that we are always keen for partners on City Talk. Yesterday we did one in partnership with the Urban Land Institute, which was a terrific session, and we were really appreciative of their support and partnership on that. And similarly today and Thursday, we're appreciative of the support and partnership from WSP. Elliot Capel works at WSP, and he is a board member of CUI. CUI is fortunate to have tremendous board leadership on these issues, and many of our board members are very much embedded in urban work, as is Elliot, who was the Chief Resilience Officer for Toronto before he joined WSP. And he has, and his colleagues have put together these sessions this week, so today and Thursday, both around this topic of resilience and recovery and the relationship between investment and economies and infrastructure. And that's why we're so fortunate to have John Godfrey and Amarjeet Sohi with us, both honorables, both former federal ministers, both urbanites. Amarjeet comes to us from Edmonton, and John today is in Toronto, and we appreciate them taking time to be with us. And I'm going to start with each of you, if you are comfortable, just telling us, just take a couple of minutes if you would, and tell us what you're doing now, because everybody wants to know where a politician goes after they're no longer a politician, and what you're focused on now. But then I want you to just speak a little bit about what you're seeing. So keep these comments initially, the introductory ones, as brief as you can. What are you doing now, and what have you been observing the COVID impact is on cities? So Amarjeet, I'll go to you first because you are in sunny Edmonton.
Yeah. First of all, Mary, thank you, and also thank you to Elliot for reaching out to me to be part of this conversation. As you said, I am in Edmonton, which is a TD6 territory, which I want to acknowledge at the start. I am currently working with an advisory and consulting firm based in Ottawa called ALAR Strategy Group. I'm the senior advisor to their clients. Before that, I was a city councillor for 3 terms in Edmonton, and then member of parliament from here, and served in 2 portfolios, infrastructure as well as natural resources. This is a very, very timely and important conversation that we're having, because municipalities are so critical for our day-to-day well-being and the services they provide, and the challenges they're facing today because of COVID-19 are very serious challenges, and we need to find solutions. And I hope that today's conversation will generate some of those solutions that all orders of government can take seriously.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. John, tell us about what you're up to and what you've been observing too. I know that you are banging pots on Avenue Road at 7 o'clock, because I've seen it on Facebook. But tell us, in addition to that, I want to hear more about what are you doing now and what are you observing post-COVID?
It takes up at least 5 minutes of my day, and it's a great exercise. You get to see your neighbors at a distance. So after I left federal politics, one of the things I got involved with was being a special advisor to the Provincial Government of Ontario on climate change until that was up until 2018 when the government changed. The thing I've been focusing on since then has been the whole issue of how unprepared we are as a society for future climate events. I've been spending less time on the mitigation carbon side, more time on downscaled extreme climate events and how we can predict them and what we can do about them and what it means for our financial system. And so specifically, I've been advising a startup company called Alice Insights, which works on with artificial intelligence, big data, machine learning to try and predict on a downscaled basis what might be coming with future climate events and what the financial implications of all of that are. So I'm working with a bunch of guys from the U of T who are also involved with some folks from Oxford. So the relevance of that for our conversation today is that clearly cities need to know on a more downscaled basis what might be coming their way beyond the normal 100-year storms and historic ways of looking at the past. We need new ways of looking at the future so that we can protect our infrastructure and our populations. What I'm observing, of course, right now is that everything is frozen because of the situation we're in. And I guess the question we'll want to be exploring is, when we come out of this, A, how will we come out of it? And B, will we be more alert to those sorts of issues? Not so much the COVID side, which has got a whole other series of challenges associated with it, but will this experience have made us more thoughtful about green infrastructure and being better prepared and more resilient for the future? Not just for disease, but for physical events generated by climate change.
So can you just tell me what downscaled means?
Downscaled means that normally when we do climate models, we can be fairly good at an area, Southern Ontario, a certain specific geographic space. Downscaled means that you are able to get down much to a more granular level, look at something, for example, at a hydroelectric plant or a nuclear plant, because you have managed to combine atmospheric physics up here with Earth surface properties down here, and you can be more precise about what you think the future risks are to specific geographically limited places like cities or highways or ports or things that are downscaled. Does that help?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess what, I guess we as urbanists would say that everything should be downscaled. That everything needs to be looked at from the street, that we need to have the most granular that we can.
Absolutely. That's why this work is.
So, gents, I want to get your candid perspectives on this, because you know what a cabinet dynamic is. And you know that there is a constant now petitioning going on with the federal government about how they're just every day, there's a new announcement about a new investment. And I'm wondering what your perspective is around what John's just implied, which is, can it be a greener investment? Is this a moment? Do we have a moment where, and I noticed today, for instance, that the Prime Minister has tied some conditions to his financial support of large business. He's actually put some conditions on it. We're having sessions here every couple of days, and we've had one on the two emergencies, COVID and climate combining. We've had a lot of urging around, can procurement favor local? Can you talk to us frankly about just tell us, what's the dynamic like in Ottawa right this minute? You were both there, and how is that going to win out? Who wins out in terms of what the Minister of Finance's decision-making is going to be prioritized on? Amarjeet.
Mary, I think before we go into the recovery discussion and what stimulus can look like, what needs to go into that, I think we need to understand that municipalities are facing some serious financial pressures at this time.
So let's talk about that first. What do you think the solution is to that?
I think the federal government and the provinces need to work together to find immediate relief in making sure that municipalities are able to sustain and continue to provide essential services that citizens rely on, from public transit to picking up garbage every day to, police services, fire and paramedic services, and cleaning up roads and running our traffic smoothly. These are essential services that citizens rely on. And municipalities have only two sources, property taxes and user fees. And both of those sources have been hammered by COVID-19. So I think that's the immediate crisis, though the capacity of municipalities to actually respond to this crisis and respond to the recovery will be limited if we do not find solutions that are more sustainable and permanent to make sure that municipalities have the resources.
So there's an immediate relief question because municipalities are hemorrhaging. And we know that in some parts of the country, the provinces have permitted them to be able to borrow, to run a deficit. That's true in BC. Many are borrowing from their capital reserves to fund operating. Any other thoughts from either of you about how this immediate gap that's growing every day, how does that get resolved just for now, in the real 2020 time? Thoughts?
I think, because municipalities fall under the jurisdiction of provinces, I'm pretty sure there's some reluctant at the federal level to directly engage with municipalities. And that has been the case all the time, even though when I was a Minister of Infrastructure, we tried to find ways to directly engage with municipalities, whether it was through the gas tax funding or through Federation of Canadian Municipalities, or designing our programs in a way that municipalities get the necessary support. I don't think anybody is going to open up the constitutional discussion at this time, right? I think what we need to figure out is that all governments need to find creative ways of working together so the municipalities have the support. So I think provinces would need to be part of this solution as well as the federal government. As far as the recovery is concerned, Mary, I think there are three outcomes that you want to see out of this recovery. One is obviously you want to create jobs, because jobs are essential because the unemployment rate is the highest that we are facing. The other is the lens of sustainability. The infrastructure that we're going to build into the future, that sustainability lens has to be part of that discussion. And the third is, are we building communities that are socially cohesive? Are we creating opportunities for everyone as we recover from COVID-19? So environmental sustainability as well as the social inclusion has to be part of that discussion.
So those would be your three: job, sustainability, and socially cohesive. Those would be three. Would those be actually overarching goals or principles to however we invest now?
That's what I think that my perspective is, because, look at the impact of COVID-19. Where is the impact? More women are being impacted by job losses. More people from cultural minority communities are being impacted by job losses. So if we are looking at building infrastructure that does not create jobs and opportunities for those groups, that you're not then looking at the potential and not actually tackling the problem to the effective way as much as possible, right? Second is to look at the gaps that COVID has identified. Where are those gaps? Who are being impacted the most? People, vulnerable people, homeless people, people who don't have adequate affordable housing, people who work in low-income jobs in long-term extended care facilities, or making meat packing plants where working conditions are not at par as you would see in other areas. I think that social inclusion lens is equally important as the lens of sustainability, and making sure that benefits are reaching to those who who need those benefits, and that we build a society that only environmentally sustainable, but also socially cohesive.
So you're reinforcing that pyramid of social, economic, and environmental. John, what's your thinking on in terms of the immediate bleeding? Forget about stimulus, just the relief that municipal governments are seeking and that FCM has been advocating for. What's your thought on the solution to that?
Well, I mean, I think that people are improvising, and
Great.
at all three levels.
Right.
And it's, I think survival is the name of the game. I mean, when I watch the buses, empty buses go up and down in front of me on Avenue Road here in Toronto, and I realize how many millions of dollars every week the city is spending. It seems to me that the longer term plans are much endangered by the fact that all three levels of government are bleeding. And so the temptation, I'm afraid, is that when this comes to an end, people will say, well, I can't be addressing all these other things. I'm just kind of trying to build up my reserves to where they were. And there will not be a taste for continuing to spend at any of the levels. And so that this survival mode jeopardize all. I think that people are just thinking, how much money should I set aside for the homeless? I mean, I have been seeing, as I drive occasionally around the city, all these tents, which are now under the Gardiner Expressway, where homeless people are living in parks and all the rest of it. So the idea that we can somehow leapfrog ahead of where we were before we actually catch up to where we were, if you see what I mean. And I think the temptation will be to go, everybody is hoping for a big bang, which I don't think will happen in terms of an economic recovery. I think it'll be slow and dragged out and sectoral and partial and all that stuff. And therefore the ability of people to think creatively and to get ahead of the agenda and put us ahead of where we were is going to be very problematic.
I feel like both of you were kind of dodging the key question, which is, where does the money come from to fill the immediate gap? I don't know. I don't know if that's your political instincts still hardwired inside you, so you can't actually tell me what you think the answer is for that.
No, I have been very vocal. I've been active on social media, encouraging federal government to ensure municipalities have the support, and I've been supporting the FCM's call for intervention from the federal government. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that because of that constitutional jurisdictional issues, I think federal government will be reluctant unless provinces are part of the solution. I think it is a shared responsibility of the federal government and the provinces to find solutions to provide necessary support. Not only the immediate, I hope that out of this crisis, we learn and find permanent solutions to make sure municipalities have resources beyond property taxes and user fees. When you look at the majority of the economic activity is generated in urban centers, and those urban centers, in order to make sure that quality services are provided, are dependent on revenue sources that are not actually tied to economic activity.
So let's go there, because Paul Bedford and others are raising it on the chat and saying, well, now is this the perfect time? I'll just read what Paul is suggesting: to embrace road pricing, a share of income and sales taxes for cities. What do you think, gentlemen? Is now the time to be advocating for that kind of significant, as John suggested, you know, after we're done with the emergency, are we going to fall back to, oh, you're on your own, kids, make property tax work? Or do you think it's a moment to introduce some really strong, and that would be with the provinces, partnership on different revenue tools? What do you think? John, what do you think?
Well, first of all, you asked earlier, where's the money going to come from? And the answer is people are going to borrow it until some other solution comes along.
Which people, though? Which people?
the cities. I mean, they're going to be they have to keep paying for the police. They have to keep paying for transit. They're just going to borrow the money and hope that low interest rates prevail. So that's how that's going to work for the time being until we know when this comes to an end. The deeper question is this the perfect time to do road pricing and all that kind of stuff? Speaking as a former politician, as opposed to a technocrat, I would say psychologically, probably not. The last thing you want to be able to tell a population which is also reeling from job loss and lower income is, oh, by the way, welcome home. Before you get your job back, I'm going to increase road pricing or whatever the heck it is. I just think psychologically, logically, it makes tons of sense. Psychologically and politically, I don't think so. I mean, I think you're going to have a really difficult time selling that. You're hitting me when I'm down. I have less money and now you're going to charge me more? Well, I have to because we haven't got any. Yeah, but I'm in trouble here. So I just don't think that's psychologically and politically wise, but I could be wrong.
What do you think, Amarjeet?
You know, I agree with John on the political realities that we're facing amid a crisis. I don't think any government will look at exploring different ways of raising revenue. But I think what this, I think, may happen or should happen is a reflection of the long-term sustainability, because this COVID-19 situation has really exposed fundamental challenges that municipalities are facing. Whether we find solutions in 1 year, 2 years, or 5 years, I don't know. That is more of a political discussion, and that political thinking needs to go into into that. You know, but I think solutions needs to be found. Another thing that I think we need to be aware of, and we have seen this creeping its ugly head is the issue of racism and discrimination. As people, you know, we at this time, I think all Canadians are pulling together because we understand the urgency. As we go into the recovery mode, and this recovery is not going to be short term, it's going to be long term recovery, and some people will tend to blame or find people and other people, someone to blame for their own cause of frustration and anxiety. And that can easily give rise to racism and discrimination in our communities, which absolutely municipalities have been at the forefront of fighting. And how do we support that along with infrastructure investments, that the soft services that communities needs to provide in order to make sure that they're able to tackle with those emerging social issues?
I mean, as you suggest, it's municipal governments that experience the disconnection around equity most viscerally, and we've been suggesting it's a particle accelerator, that all the issues that pre-existed that were dysfunctional in urban life, COVID's just accelerated them and made them so clear. So in terms of how people are living and where they're living. And so if you think of the two key things, if we were having this conversation before March 11, and we had you on and we were going to talk about pressing issues in urban environments, my suspicion is that the two things we would be leading with would be transit and housing. That these are the two pieces of infrastructure that are inadequately funded and appear to be an inadequate supply or a mismatch of supply. And now it's totally a crisis. So what's your sense of how can those be prioritized? Can we, and John, in terms of your comment about, you know, and we're all commenting on this, you look at the transit now, you look at the streetcars that pass our street or the bus or the subway, they're virtually empty, but they're having to be, the service has to be actually increased so that they can have the right distribution of passengers, so they can't run things at full supply anymore. They can't reduce service because then they're too crowded. Obviously, we've got people on the chat saying, are people going to be willing to go back into transit? And are we going to continue to be committed to transit? And how do you run transit off a diminished, completely gutted fare box and the limited resources that are available? So, you're all about climate change. Transit is the most environmentally sensible way to get around, other than walking around in bikes. What do you think?
And the challenge, I think, is that though here in Toronto, for example, we've seen some effort by the mayor to make, on a fairly marginal basis, I must say, as I go around, more street space available for pedestrians and cyclists, which is a nice answer, and we're coming into spring. But there's a complete little conundrum in this one, because clearly as the recovery comes along, which we all want, more people will be going downtown, although some may stay at home. That's true, but there'll be a greater demand on the transportation system. At the same time, the transit system, if people are distancing, can't have the same capacity. So what will people do? They'll take their cars.
And then the GHG, and then we'll lose all, air pollution will go again.
And therefore, it's because transit can't be efficient under these conditions if you're going to have the number of potential customers by social distancing. And so it will go against any efforts to turn over more of the public domain in terms of roads to cyclists and pedestrians. Problem will become more acute as we recover, as a greater percentage of people need to get back to their offices or their stores or wherever the heck they're going. That's a tough one.
Yeah, I mean, I think the gas tax was cobbled together on your watch. Am I right? Or no? Was it before you?
Yes, it was. And by the way, I do think here's one possibility, and this is really being sneaky, so don't anybody listen to it. But you'll notice that I'm just talking now about the price of gas at the pump. If you're going out running as I do, and you pass the same gas station every day, you're kind of aware that the price of a liter of gas has gone from a low of, I think, 79.9 to up to 90. I think it was yesterday. I didn't know. I forgot to look this morning. My point being that there might be a way of introducing a gas tax or increasing the gas tax to fill the gap, which has the price which has dropped because of a lower demand. If you had some kind of flexible arrangement so it didn't look to the driver or anybody else as if you're worse off. Now, the trick of it would be to keep it in some kind of balance. And of course, as demand returns, the price of gas will go up, so the amount of money you might take in would go down. But I think some kind of a strategy like that, you could, and you could be honest. I mean, you have to be honest with people and say, look, the reason I'm doing this is to do all these other things, but you're not worse off than you were before. Maybe, and maybe that's some way of doing it, although it's a bit messy.
Andre Darmanin, who's on the chat. Andre, he's saying, forget the gas tax. Andre, can you put into this chat box what you think the alternatives are? Or are you echoing what Paul Bedford was saying, road pricing and sales of growth taxes, which these gentlemen say it's not the right political time to do it. Just give us some suggestions of what you're thinking. Amarjeet, any thoughts on transit? I mean, we're in conversation with lots and lots of ministers' offices federally at the CUI. We put together various conversations for them with various stakeholders. And on one of them, someone did say, we're looking at empty buses and saying, well, is that really Canada's problem? That a transit system hasn't got ridership. Thoughts on that?
I think that when we talk about transit, there are two components. One is the capital cost of building public transit.
Right.
Federal government has made significant commitment to support municipalities in that area for over the next 10 years. Right. I think there's a significant amount of money available from the provinces and the federal government to build the systems. I think the challenge municipalities are going to face now operating is one, but the matching. Would they have enough?
How do they find the match? Right.
Match on the capital cost, but the operational is a big thing, right? I don't know if there's a political appetite at a federal level or a provincial level to support municipalities on a permanent long-term basis in the operations of the transit systems. That's one. Another, my worry is that there will be people questioning the the need for public transit or expansion of the public transit and the utilization of the public transit. But you're absolutely right. Like if we are looking at meeting our targets related to climate change, public transit is a big part of that solution, right? So we need to make sure that we continue to support, because we can't lose sight of the fact that yes, we are facing one crisis, as Prime Minister mentioned, but we can't ignore the other crisis that our world is facing, which is climate change, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we need to continue to invest in initiatives and infrastructure that will help you achieve those targets. I think transit plays a big role, but I think there'll be a lot of rethinking about how we fund transit and how we continue to make sure it remains a viable option for a lot of people. And finally, transit is not just about mobility, right? It is also about social mobility. There are a lot of people who rely on public transit to go to school, to drop off their children at daycare, then go to school or go to work. And access to employment and opportunities will be limited for underprivileged, underemployed people if there is not an efficient and rapid public transit available to them.
I mean, I think this was the point that I feel like we have to say this point again and again and again, that cities drive the nation's economy, and that it's dependent, the healthy functioning of an urban environment is dependent on connectivity. And so if you can't move people or goods, then it diminishes the economic productivity of the city, but also it diminishes our capacity to actually move an economy forward that's actually generating wealth for the rest of the country. And that's I think it's sort of hardening some of those conversations about, there are people who wistfully now think, well, you see, cities are the problem, density is the problem, and we're all going to somehow distribute back into what I would fear, John, for you would be that we're going to encourage sprawl, we're going to encourage single family dwellings, which most Canadians can't afford and maybe don't choose to live in anymore. Can we turn this to being, I don't know, is our COVID moment our climate moment? Can we just be utterly resolved to it? John, what do you think? Maybe John is frozen or he really hated my question. I don't know. John, we're not seeing you or hearing you, so we may have to sign off and sign back in. I was going to say, Amarjeet, I was going to say the connectivity isn't just transit, it's also broadband. I mean, we're seeing that huge, vast parts of the country don't have access to broadband. Even within urban environments, people are standing in parking lots of schools and in libraries to be able to get access to the internet. It's this connectivity is diminished too, right?
Well, one of the things that I had put down as a way to stimulate the economy and what recovery of post-COVID can look like is actually investments into high-speed internet. Like we are talking about urban centers where access is available. Just think about rural communities
Right.
that want to sustain their population and they want to sustain their economies, and they don't have access to high-speed internet or digital infrastructure that is so critical for them. I think that could be a part of post-COVID recovery, where federal government in partnership with the telecoms or look at other creative solutions and build that infrastructure that is so necessary, right? Your other question about, can we ignore climate change? I think it's not a choice issue, right?
Well, it still seems to be for some. I mean, actually, John, we're glad to have you back. We talked about you while you were gone, just so you know. But Amarjeet, can you ground this conversation for us in the reality in Alberta? Because we, CUI was involved with Edmonton and Calgary talking about doing residencies in April and May there. And we were very, very impressed by the intensity of discourse going on in the urban environments in Alberta about how your economies are reinventing themselves in the post-oil world. So there are economic implications to this. Can you speak a bit to that as a a longtime city councillor in the West, in Edmonton, and then a federal member, and now back in Alberta. Just talk to us about that trade-off, and is Alberta coming around to be part of this conversation about what the new economy would look like post-oil?
I know. I think there are a lot of people out there that don't understand how diverse
Yes.
opinions are in Alberta about economic options, and oil and gas will continue to be part of Alberta's and Canada's economy for decades to come. But there's so much other stuff happening in this province that is so innovative and creative. Even in the oil and gas sector, the innovation happening to reduce emissions. Artificial intelligence investments at University of Alberta, the Edmonton being the healthcare center, and innovation that is happening in that sector, the potential of agriculture, the potential of geothermal renewables like wind and solar. I think there's so many options and so much work being done, and Albertans committed to doing their part to tackle the crisis of climate change. I think another thing that, and I raised this at your previous session in a form of a question, I think where potential exists for recovery and stimulus is that we have so many old buildings in our urban centers that you can actually retrofit them with better energy systems, and in some cases repurpose them. One third of downtown Calgary is empty because of the downturn in the economy. There are buildings in Edmonton, I'm pretty sure in other cities, that could be repurposed for rental housing or affordable housing. I think those are the creative solutions we need to find in order to create jobs, but also apply the lens of inclusivity as well as the climate change and sustainability.
I mean, that old adage, the greenest building is the one that's already built. And I'm wondering if, again, thinking back to your previous lives as federal ministers, is there a way to prioritize? You gave us some principles, Amarjeet, around jobs, sustainability, and being socially cohesive. Is there a way to prioritize that any stimulus money should work from that principle? So can we intensify existing spaces? Can we create more compact communities? Can we have a project at CUI called bringbackmainstreet.ca, and we're looking at, there are lots of older buildings on main streets that can be invested in, retrofitted. They're going to have to be retrofitted now to be pandemic proof. And those are often libraries or community centers or schools. And is there a chance for the investment program the stimulus program, to prioritize those things?
And they can be. I think their federal government has tools
Right.
to do so. One of the tools that federal government has is assessment of climate change for the infrastructure projects that they fund. Any project that is, I think the value of the project has to be more than $20 million combined investment, that climate change lens applies. And there's also community benefits lens that federal government can that has the tool to do. I understand there are organizations out there that are asking federal government to relax those tools and not apply those tools. I think that'll be a mistake on the part of for the federal government, because look at, one of the criteria for federal investments in infrastructure is that proponents of the infrastructure need to look to create opportunities for marginalized communities and women in working to build infrastructure.
Right.
That's a social good.
So you can do that through community benefit agreements and various ways that the jobs can be tied to local economies. Elliot Capel, our partner on this project, on this seminar today, is raising a question about tower renewal. So could the federal investment be directed specifically to retrofits. Also, I'm noticing Andy Fillmore, our current member of the House of Commons, is on the chat today, and he's asking about this sort of structural direction of resources. Could that result in what used to be called a New Deal for cities? Do we have a doubling down on downtowns? John, go ahead.
Well, I think, I mean, and the various people you've been quoting are absolutely cognizant of this. I mean, one of the points about the New Deal for cities and the work that Amarjeet continued with is coming together on a three-way basis to agree on what we're up to and establishing some common goals. And that is hugely powerful. I would argue, as long as interest rates are low, we now have three levels of government that can borrow money to do worthwhile things like tower renewal and achieve multiple purposes. So I think what's really important in all of these, first of all, it's really important that the conversations be three-way from the get-go. That I understand the current federal government's, because of the pressure of time, has been sort of announcing things, not without necessarily bringing other people in. I think these are much more powerful ideas. When we started working on the New Deal for cities, one of the building blocks was, well, let's just sit down and figure out how this stuff works. What do we think, you know? And then how shall we divvy up the costs and the responsibilities? And I think very importantly, throughout all of this, I think we have to make one big bet, which is that we will find a way out of our current situation, which will allow us to fill streetcars and get back to where we were, while still anticipating that we've built a better and stronger society for the future. So this is a good time for longer term planning on all of these issues. And it's a good time to be sitting down and not be overly driven, panicked, or steered by where we are today. I mean, I think we have to make a long-term bet that we will get through this, and that you know, the rest of our lives will not be spent 6 feet from each other. And we've got to but we've got the time to think about it. And so let's make that assumption that something will come through, because otherwise we're, you know, I mean, what are we going to do? Just wait around?
I mean, we did. I mean, as you suggest, you know, cholera led to public health, and smallpox led to universal health care. Like, we know that these very dramatic events can cause very significant systemic change. What about the idea, not only the New Deal for cities, but what about this idea of a federal, this has been talked about, I know, and I want to hear what you two gents think, a federal department focused on urban affairs or in cities? Does that make sense? Would that be a good outcome to aim for? Amarjeet, what do you think? And then John.
Well, one of the thinking behind in 2015 when the infrastructure ministry was created, because you may know that there was no independent standalone infrastructure ministry at a federal level. It was part of the intergovernmental affairs and housed in other parts as so the whole purpose of creating that ministry was to increase that cooperation and collaboration with the municipalities, which the federal government did. You know, I remember the extensive consultations that we did with the municipality, with FCM, with with local provincial associations. So I don't know if there's a need to create a separate urban ministry. I think within the infrastructure ministry, there's enough flexibility to focus on urban issues, which we did. For example, Smart Cities Challenge came out of infrastructure portfolio. I think one more point that I want to make, Mary, is the potential exists as we look at a recovery. And it again ties into climate change goals and ties into transit. We should be looking at electrification of our transit system, right? In the buses that we use now mainly are on diesel. And we can work, federal government should look, and provinces should look for opportunities to work with the cities to transition those fleets from diesel to electric vehicles and other heavy-duty vehicles that municipalities have to use. What do? You reduce emissions, but you also foster innovation that can be applicable in other areas of the transportation, because transportation accounts for, I think, 25% of the emissions in the country, right? If you focus on that, then you focus on rebuilding retrofit and in repurposing buildings, right? I think there's so many things that we can be done to create jobs at the same time tackle climate change.
John, do you want to jump in on that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think if you look over the history of the federal government's involvement with cities, going back to the first Trudeau, back to the 70s, when I think we actually used the word urban and cities, there's a long history which people keep forgetting. And then when I was minister, cities was the word that dared not be actually uttered by a politician. So we used the word communities, which is so wussy, for God's sake. Anyway, that was particularly feeble, I thought. And then we called it the New Deal for Cities, like duh. My view is that we absolutely need to make some kind of a permanent, I'm not sure if it goes with infrastructure, maybe because infrastructure's got money, why not? But here's the difference between what I would see as the role of a future urban affairs minister and a normal kind of siloed, specific kind of ministry. I think the job in the future for the city's minister, let's just call that person what it is until we figure out the euphemism we're going to use next, that person needs to be a bit of a diplomat within the entire federal government to be able to say, gee, this we're in care actually has a city's in. I wonder if you thought about that. And that's not usually the function of a minister. At the best, it's the function of the Privy Council office. But I do think a kind of heightened awareness by the city's minister of all of the dimensions which might involve environment, which might involve energy, which could involve all sorts of things, being alert to all of the parts that the federal government can bring into play and encouraging those three-way conversations, because you don't want to, it's equally important to involve the provinces in these conversations. The difficulties are obviously self-evident. It deals with the personalities and agendas of 13 premiers and God knows how many mayors and the federal government, but you have to do it. And you have to find strategies which survive changes of regime at any of the three levels, so that there's always a kind of not a kind of an infrastructure, not overly heavy, which allows people to be reminded, gee, we've got some bits of that story over on this side. You don't normally think of it on the Canadian heritage side or whatever it is. So I think that's the kind of role that a future urban affairs city's minister needs to play, and it's a very different role than a traditional cabinet role, because
I mean, if I hear you're both advocating for, and I know we hear this in other City Talk chats, that people really appreciate the level of collaboration that they see right now, that there seems to be a kind of commitment that we're all hands on deck, we're in it together, and there seems to be a kind of sorting of lanes and not a lot of complaints about jurisdictional interference and stuff. So the question is, as you suggest, is it someone in the House of Commons that has that kind of lens and brings it to bear, or do we create something else? I don't know. Could you ever see municipal governments be as part of some kind of a first minister's table? Would that ever exist, where you would open that up, or would provinces just go crazy at the thought of that?
Well, Mary.
Well, I think you want to start small and modest and respectful, right. And then there you can build out, and then you can have specific conferences where that would be appropriate right. to involve 2 or 3 levels of government. I think what you need to do in the first instance is develop capacity and trust which survives the change of political regimes. And I don't think it can be left. I mean, you need an alert and powerful civil service from all 3 levels of government to back that up. But you need to build something that's strong enough that will survive changes of regime at all three levels.
I mean, certainly at the political level now, we know that Mr. Freeland and often the Prime Minister, but someone from the federal government at a senior level talks with mayors every Thursday night. That's our understanding at the FCN brokers that conversation. So that is happening. But we also know, for instance, on the rent that the federal government introduced, that it required significant negotiations with provincial governments, who then had to make decisions about whether they would support moratoriums on eviction. So it's a deal by deal thing, a lot of brokering. Amarjeet, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, we tried to create that tripartite table, and we were successful in some cases earlier on when we had the provincial ministers come together with federal government. We invited the Federation of Canadian Municipalities to be part of it at our annual gathering. We did that twice. There was different level of resistance, I would say, from some provinces. Some were open to the idea, some were not. But I agree with John. Right? These things take time. And you need to start taking those small steps and build the trust that federal government is not there to, overtake or undermine the jurisdictional arrangements that provinces have, right? Because I think this is an opportunity. I think one thing that COVID-19 has been devastating for our economy and our families, and my heart goes out to everyone being impacted and the loved ones being lost to this. But if there's a silver lining, that is that there's more cooperation and collaboration and willingness to work together to find solutions. I think we need to build on that kind of goodwill and realization that we are in this together. This crisis eventually will go away. But what are some of the lasting things that we can learn and do that actually make us more humble to be focusing on people that we serve and finding solutions, keeping in mind that those are the people who have put us in this place of decision making.
Yeah, we have that crass version, there's only one taxpayer, but it's also that we are fundamentally, cities are people. Yeah. And we want the best quality of life that we can have for ourselves and for our families and our communities. As we sort of round up here, gentlemen, I want to just pass each of you to each do a little quick little closing thing for the group to keep in mind. We often see the federal government as kind of the standard bearers, and they signal what our values are, what Canadian values are. And I think we've seen that again and again through this. The Prime Minister's been playing that role. So in terms of your urging, in terms of what you think the values set should be that would infuse federal investment and stimulus, what would it be? First to you, John, and then to Amarjeet.
I think that the chief value of all of this is a lot more conversation, cooperation, and respectful discourse on and really open questions like what would be the best solution to this problem? What do we all think? Not to the point that we get bogged down, we can't make decisions, but that we actually reach out and create those relationships between politicians at all three levels and commit to a kind of public common purpose which this crisis has revealed. I mean, this would be awful to lose the advantage of this crisis. This is a terrific moment.
Don't waste a crisis.
Entrench it in some way that will remain after the crisis is over.
Amarjeet, what do you think?
No, I talked about those three principles at the start of the conversation, Mary. But whatever we do or would have to do is not possible if you don't have strong municipalities, if you don't have strong communities, right? Recovery is dependent on their partnership. because that's where the activities are. That's where the economic activity is. That's where people live, in urban centers and communities, right? So if communities are unable to participate in their recovery and contribute and do their part, and I think that is not going to be possible. I think there are opportunities for us to invest more in affordable housing, right, which is a great need for that. I think electrification, I talked about earlier, uh, building, retrofitting the existing building and repurposing them, broadband internet, high-speed internet for rural communities. There are a lot of opportunities that do exist, but what they require is strong communities and municipalities. And for that, going back to the original question of the long-term sustainability, financial sustainability of those communities, very, very critical.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a pregnant moment, isn't it? Of where we're having to respond immediately to what's going on around us, but as we suggest, lay the track, lay the groundwork for what can be a much better, more sustainable future. So thank you, gentlemen, for taking your years of experience and your understanding of how these things actually roll out, and coupling it with your values and the priorities that you exercised when you were in office and that you continue to exercise in your post-political life. Thank you very much for being part of a City Talk. And as I suggested, the conversation starts here. It'll continue. Lots and lots of great suggestions and feedback and comments in that chat box, which will, as I suggest, live on. So I want to thank WSP for helping us put this together. And on Thursday, Elliot and Timo also helped us with putting a second one on, which will be practitioners across the country talking about resilient investments and what that will look like. And I think using the lens of equity, as Amarjeet strongly emphasized, and John, who wants the sustainability piece, the climate piece woven into it. So I think we'll see all that happening on Thursday. Join us here noon City Talk, noon Eastern. Tomorrow we are holding our first partner event, which is as I suggested, an opportunity for other organizations. If you want to take advantage of the City Talk platform, let us know. And that one tomorrow is sponsored by the University of Toronto, Scarborough, the York's City Institute, and the Goethe Institute. And it'll be moderated by Ahmed Alawala and Roger Kyle, who will moderate discussion looking at the concept of what it means to be urban citizens in this pandemic. And they'll be bringing perspectives from Berlin, Vancouver, and Toronto. So we are very appreciative of their engagement. That'll be tomorrow. That's tomorrow. Then Thursday, the sustainability resilience piece. And then on Friday, I'm having a one-on-one with the Honorable, Her Worship. I guess she's not honorable yet, or she was honorable. I guess she's no longer, she's still honorable. Her Worship Bonnie Crombie, the Mayor of Mississauga, former federal member as well. So thanks again, gentlemen. Really, really delighted to have you. And thanks everybody for tuning in. The conversation continues. #CityTalk. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.